Hi guys, Chelsea the Reading Outlaw here to do the June wrap up for 2015. As I talked about in my May wrap up video, I have started using the reading spreadsheet from Brock at Let's Read, which I will link to below. And as part of that, we get some really awesome stats, updates, and charts and all kinds of fun things. So I'm going to start off the wrap up with some numbers and some stats stuff, and then I'll get into the actual books themselves. Excuse me. I read a total of 10 books this month, 3 graphic novels, 4 fantasy books, 1 science fiction book, 1 middle grade fantasy book, and 1 YA book. There were 4,233 total pages for an average of 470 pages per book. The author breakdown was 80% male, 10% female, and 10% both. That 10% comes from Fiona Staples and Brian K. Vaughan, who wrote the 4th volume of Saga, which I read this month, which we'll get to. In terms of where I got my books from, it's not really surprising. 78% came from the library, 19% were books that I owned, and 3% were books that I read through the Scribd subscription service, which offers comic books, ebooks, and audiobooks. In terms of like the rating breakdown, the average number of stars this month was a 4.2. So I had, in terms of that, I had a pretty good reading month. Really, the only book that I was not a huge fan of was Dune by Frank Herbert, which you'll know if you watched my video on Monday, which was a wrap-up / review of that. I gave 3 5-star books, 4 4-star books, 1 3-star book, and 2 2-star books. So that is the numbers breakdown for this month, and of course the graphs that go along with them. Now let's talk about the actual books themselves. As always, I don't actually have physical copies of all of the books, some because I'm such a big library user, a lot of them I've had to go back. But I will start by showing you the ones that I have, and then I will go on to talk about the ones that I don't have. So first things first, Dune by Frank Herbert. This was one of my 2-star reads this month. I was not a big fan of this. I had some style issues and some issues with kind of repetition. Like I said, you will know. I'll try and do the info box thing and link to that review of Dune that I put up on Monday. But yeah, not a big fan. Also this month, I finished The Search for the Red Dragon by James A. Owen. This is the second book in the Chronicles of the Imaginarium Geographica. I did not like this one as much as I liked the first one, but as always, or as with the first one, I enjoyed kind of the puzzles and figuring out the illusions, and I think that that's what makes these really good books for adults or readers who have kind of had that kind of broad liberal artsy kind of introduction to fairy tales and myths and kind of the canon, the Western canon as we know it, because this book makes a lot of references to that, a lot of different English fairy tales and myths and things like that. The good thing in this book is that we're starting to get more poetry as well as more mythology from outside, just like the British Isles. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. As always, one of my favorite things about reading the book are the, excuse me, the chapter artwork that goes at the front of every one. They're these really heavy like ink drawings, and I just think that they're really pretty. So yeah, I really enjoy reading that. Next up this month are the rest of the other 2 things I have to show you that I have physical copies of are graphic novels. The first is Saga Volume 4. This is the one I talked about that's a male-female co-authorship. Written by Brian K. Vaughan, illustrated by Fiona Staples. I'm absolutely in love with this book. This series. I think that the artwork within the series is absolutely fantastic. Here's another good page. I really like the color palette that's used. The story itself is of Elena and Marco, who are from one is from a planet, one is from the moon of that planet. The 2 are at war. 2 countries are at war. Elena and Marco fall in love and have a baby. That happens on like the very first one. The rest is just their adventures as they flee across the galaxy. There are people hunting them because their family is not supposed to exist. Because they are, different races from 2 warring countries, they're not supposed to be together. People aren't okay with it. In this book, we start to see kind of the exploration of Alana and Marco's marital structure and what toll their having to flee through space has on their marriage. Their baby's growing up. She's absolutely adorable. I just absolutely love the series. If you haven't read them, get a hold of them. You'll fly through them. I love Saga. That's Saga Volume 4. And lastly, the other graphic novel I read this month that I have is Wraith by Joe Hill. This is kind of a prequel to his 2013 novel, I think, Nosferatu, which is about Charlie Manx, a whole different kind of vampire. This book, it's not required that you read Nosferatu to read this. You can read this whenever you'd like. It's just a prequel. It sets up kind of how Charlie Manx became who he is. Like we talked about, or like I should have talked about before when I hauled it, the artwork itself is absolutely terrifying. The story itself is both incredibly sad and incredibly scary. I could not more highly recommend picking this up if you're into horror books and kind of dark, really dark fantasy books. Nobody kind of does that, I think, like Joe Hill. I think there's some family lineage stuff going on there that's helping out with that, but Joe Hill's imagination is absolutely fantastic and absolutely terrifying. You have to pick it up. Moving on to the stuff that I don't have to show you, we'll talk about some more graphic novels, because also this month I read Chew Volume 5, Major League, and Chew Volume 6, Space Cakes, both by John Layman and Rob Guillory. This is just, obviously the next, the fifth and sixth installment in the series. We are still with psychopathic detective Tony Chu as he works on solving cases. He's now been demoted to the traffic division from his former FDA post. I won't explain why. We also are learning more about his family. His family members all have kind of a different range of psychopathic or eating-based powers. I love this series. I've talked about this series to death since like March when I first came back to YouTube because Lindsay Ray and Sam from Novels and Nonsense were talking about it, and I just couldn't wait to get a hold of it. Do yourself a favor and pick it up. It's gross. It's not as gross as it sounds. People are always worried about the cannibalism aspect because that's how Tony Chu helps solve crimes. He has to eat or consume human flesh, but it's not nearly as bad as it sounds. The books are funny. They're full of like nerd shout outs. I just think that they're absolutely great. That wraps up, in case you guys are wondering what I'm looking at, I have like my list of books that I read this month. I have to like write them down because I don't have that many of them still like lying around physically. That wraps up the graphic novels in ebook, or there's one more book that I read. There's one more actual novel that I read that I don't have, and that's Inda by Sherwood Smith. I finished this as part of a buddy read with Sarah from Books and Junk and Connor from Connor O'Brien. I didn't love it. I liked the first half more than the second half, and I hated the second half. I did not like it at all. We are thinking, I'm planning on reading the second one with that same group, if not a couple more people. I'm just not sure when because the TBR is filling up fast. But that was Inda by Sherwood Smith. Digitally this month, I read Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson, which is the first in the Malazan? I'm not sure. I've been saying Malazan, but I've been hearing whispers recently that maybe that's wrong. The Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's an amazing read. I'm reading through it slowly with Sam from Novels and Nonsense and Connor from Connor O'Brien. Caitlin from Kitty G and Michael from Bitten by Your Radioactive Book are also listening in and kind of offering their advice. They've already read it before. It's a very complicated fantasy series. The first book is very much just learn as you go, read as you go. There's no info dumping. Stephen Erickson has a really great way of crafting his plot and his characters so that you're able to understand what's going on while at the same time being completely confused as to what's happening. So I'm really enjoying it. I'm reading, I'm planning on reading my way through the series at like one book a month. As far as I know, the group I'm reading it with is kind of planning on sticking together, but we don't have any concrete plans to do that yet. But I'm hoping to continue on with the series because I'm really, really liking working my way through it. In audiobook, and lastly, there are 2 audiobooks that I listened to this month. The first one was The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Adia. This one I just recently finished and talked about, and I absolutely loved it. It was a YA book based on the Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights. Scheherazade is a young teenager, and she marries the Caliph of Khorasan, and the whole thing is that he has been marrying brides and then murdering them like the next morning for a reason that nobody knows. So Scheherazade decides that she's going to be the next bride, but she's going to survive, and she does. Surviving to the next day means that her and the Khorasan get married. The rest of the story is about their relationship and how it grows and develops, and how Scheherazade struggles with the reasons that she's there in the first place, which is to avenge her best friend, who was one of the brides that the Caliph murdered. It's also about her conflicting, growing emotions, and the fact, as she gets to know the Caliph, she realizes he's not all evil, and so she has to struggle through that. It's also about members of her family and her former life who are fighting for her and who don't understand what's happening. It's gorgeously written. The prose is beautiful. I loved listening to it on audiobook. It was just such like a luxurious experience. I picked it up because I saw it floating around all over BookTube. And I'm so glad that I did because it was fan friggin' tastic. And I just could not have enjoyed it more. It made me want to go back and read the original 1001 Nights. And I'm just so glad that I was able to find it on audiobook through the library. And lastly is a book that I literally just finished up last night on my drive home from work. It was a reread because I'm getting ready to start the sequel with a buddy reading group thing. It's Blood Song by Anthony Ryan. This is the first in the Raven Shadow trilogy. I believe that's what it's called. I'm so bad at remembering like trilogy and series names. But I just finished this last night. It's a reread. I first read it when it came out, but it's been a while, and I wanted to be fresh going into the reread or the first read of Tower Lord, which is the sequel. So yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a very much so kind of I don't want to say like a stereotypical fantasy, but it kind of follows that structure of, boy goes to special training academy, goes through tests, has adventures, makes friends, develops powers, learns about himself kind of thing. Really enjoyed it. Have heard mixed reviews about the second one, so I have my fingers crossed. But that is the last audiobook and last book that I read this month. That wraps up the month of June 2015. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, if you have thoughts on anything. Let me know if you think that there's anything I should add to my reading list in July, because I'm just now finalizing it. And if nothing else, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys around the internet. Bye.